Welcome, everyone, to today's custom-tailored deep dive. Now, before we even take our first step into today's material, I'm going to ask you to do us a huge favor.
Please do.
Yeah, please take just a second right now to like and subscribe to the show. It genuinely helps us keep bringing you these deep, unfiltered looks into the most fascinating and, honestly, sometimes the most polarizing source materials out there.
It really does make a huge difference for this show.
Exactly. So today our mission is to examine a brand new, meticulously detailed, and highly controversial ebook. It's titled Church of England, Great Hymns, Traditions, Prayer, Pilgrimage, and Rites.
Written by Conrad Riker.
Right, by Conrad Riker, and it was just published this year in 2025. And let me tell you right out of the gate, whether you are intensely curious about European history or, the gritty mechanics of evolutionary psychology or the absolute front lines of modern culture wars, you are going to want to buy this book.
It is definitely a dense read.
It is ultra long, incredibly incisive, and just a fascinating argument aimed specifically at understanding the history of Western institutions before they were, and I'm using the author's exact words here, captured by feminists and Marxists.
Which sets the tone immediately.
It really does. So for those of you who want to explore this text yourself, you should absolutely check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book, and make sure to follow the author at Conrad and Riker on Substack. That's at CONRADNRIKER.
And to really understand the architecture of this book, you have to understand exactly who Riker is speaking to here.
Yeah, let's establish that context.
This is written directly for a men's rights activist audience. He is specifically appealing to men who identify with the red-pilled manosphere.
Right.
He takes an immense amount of historical data spanning literally hundreds of years, and he combines it with modern biological and neurological studies.
Which is a pretty unique approach.
It is. His ultimate goal is to argue that the ancient traditions of the Church of England weren't just, spiritual window dressing. He claims they were highly sophisticated, biologically optimized systems.
Designed to do what, exactly?
Designed specifically to forge masculine resilience, enforce hierarchy, and build leadership.
Right. Which brings up something we need to make crystal clear before we get into the weeds today.
The disclaimer.
Yes, the mandatory impartiality disclaimer. Because Riker is writing directly to that manosphere demographic and taking direct, unapologetic aim at progressive institutions, his claims are incredibly polarizing.
Very much so.
So, as your guides today, our goal isn't to take a side. We are remaining completely impartial here. We are not endorsing Conrad Riker's viewpoints, and, we aren't condemning them either.
We're just looking at the blueprints of his argument.
Exactly. We are simply putting his actual arguments under the microscope to show you exactly how he connects biology, history, and theology in the original source material. We just want to unpack the claims so you can understand the mechanics of his worldview.
I think that's really the only fair way to approach a text like this. If you just react to the politics of it, you miss the underlying thesis.
And it's a very complex thesis.
Right, because it relies on some highly specific interpretations of human neurochemistry, acoustic physics, and evolutionary history. Our job today is to look at the load-bearing pillars of his argument and examine how he builds this case from the ground up.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand where Riker is coming from, you have to look at his foundational premise.
Yeah.
He basically argues that traditional Anglican practices, the things you might associate with, quiet Sunday mornings or polite society.
Tea and crumpets.
Yeah, exactly. He says those were actually highly evolved tools for biological and psychological survival. He completely rejects the idea that male leadership and female nurturing are just social constructs.
He views them as hardwired biological realities.
Right, and to set the benchmark for what he considers actual undeniable masculinity, he doesn't look at modern influencers or anything like that. He goes all the way back to 1556.
To Archbishop Thomas Cranmer.
Yes. But for the listener who might just know Cranmer as, a name from a high school history textbook, what is the actual context here? Why pick him as the ultimate alpha male?
It's a very deliberate historical anchor for Riker. Thomas Cranmer was essentially the main architect of the Reformed Church of England under King Henry VIII and later Edward VI.
You wrote the Book of Common Prayer, right?
He did. But when the Catholic Queen Mary I took the throne, the political and religious winds shifted violently. Cranmer was imprisoned. He was tried for treason and heresy.
And he was under immense pressure.
Unimaginable psychological pressure. And under the threat of a horrific death, he actually broke. He signed several recantations, officially renouncing his Protestant faith and accepting papal authority.
So he caved.
He did. And for Riker, this represents a moment of completely understandable human frailty. But the benchmark of masculinity, the core of Riker's point, comes in what happens next.
Because he doesn't just quietly fade away into history.
No, he doesn't. Because despite those signed recantations, Mary's government decides they're going to execute him anyway.
Wow.
So, on the day he is to be burned at the stake, Cranmer is brought to the University Church in Oxford to make a final public statement. And instead of repeating his recantation like they expected, he dramatically withdraws it.
He openly defies the Queen.
Defies the Queen, defies the Pope. But it's the physical act at the stake that Riker really focuses on.
This is the crazy part.
When the fire is lit, Cranmer thrusts his own right hand, the specific signing hand he used to sign those recantations. He thrusts it directly into the flames first.
Unbelievable.
And he holds it there. He lets it burn to a crisp before the fire even reaches the rest of his body, as a physical punishment to himself for showing weakness.
That is an incredibly intense, bloody image to start a book with.
It really is. And Riker uses this visceral, brutal image of conviction paid in flesh, and he holds it up against what he disparagingly calls today's limp-wristed bishops.
He's basically saying, look at the absolute psychological hardness required to build a lasting institution. And what's fascinating is that he immediately pivots from this 16th century martyrdom straight into modern biological science.
He doesn't waste any time.
No. He starts talking about the actual measurable biology of spiritual leadership, specifically focusing on the science of vocal dominance. He brings up a study from the University of Sussex. Can you break down what that data actually says?
What's fascinating here is how Riker weaponizes acoustic biology to critique modern egalitarian approaches to church leadership.
Right.
He brings in this University of Sussex study, which analyzed congregational responses to different vocal registers.
Okay.
And the data show that parishioners rated clergy who spoke with baritone voices, so deeper, more resonant registers, as 23% more inspiring than those who spoke in higher tenor voices.
23% is a huge margin.
It is. And Riker doesn't just view this as an aesthetic preference, like, oh, they just prefer a nice-sounding radio voice. He connects this directly to evolutionary psychology. He relies very heavily here on the framework built by researchers like David Buss.
For those who aren't familiar with David Buss, he's kind of a giant in the field of evolutionary psychology, right? Looking at how our ancient ancestors' mating and survival strategies still dictate our modern behavior.
Exactly. And the evolutionary argument here is that a deep voice is not an accident. It is a direct biological signal of high testosterone.
Which means what to the brain?
Well, if you trace that back to our ancestors living on the savannah, high testosterone was a crucial indicator. It signaled a male's physical capability to protect the tribe, to enforce order within the group, and to wield authority effectively against external threats.
So it's a survival cue.
Precisely. Riker's argument is that human brains, both male and female, haven't really changed since the savannah. We are still hardwired at a subconscious level to respond to those acoustic signals of alpha dominance.
So he's saying that when a congregation is just sitting in the pews, their brains are basically scanning for a tribal leader who can defend them from a saber-toothed tiger, even if they are just listening to a polite sermon on charity.
That is exactly his point.
He even includes this wild personal observation from St. Paul's Cathedral to back this up. He describes watching a canon with a booming bass voice deliver a harsh sermon condemning adultery.
I remember that section.
Yeah. And according to Riker, the bankers in the congregation were literally weeping. They were deeply moved and convicted. But then weeks later, a vicar with a much higher, softer voice preached the exact same biblical text.
The exact same word.
The exact same words. And Riker says the tourists in the back were just ignoring him and taking selfies. He's arguing that the words almost don't matter if the acoustic biology isn't backing them up.
That's the core of his thesis in this section. He argues that progressive institutions try to fight biology by installing leaders based on modern concepts of equality or representation, but the flock, the congregation, is fundamentally wired to respond to alpha tones.
It's all biology to him.
Right, and he extends this biological imperative far beyond just who is standing in the pulpit. He takes it straight into the family unit, specifically the realm of fatherhood and the physical architecture of a child's brain.
Yeah, let's get into that because he absolutely torches modern parenting concepts here.
He really does.
He talks about co-parenting and egalitarian households like they are a biological disaster. And he leans on some heavy neurobiological research to make this point. There's a Yale study he brings up about the hippocampus.
Yes, the Yale study.
What is the connection he's drawing between having an authoritative father and the actual physical shape of a kid's brain?
Well, to understand his point, we have to look at what the hippocampus actually does. It's a complex brain structure embedded deep in the temporal lobe, and it is essentially the control center for memory, learning, and critically emotional regulation and stress management.
Okay, so it handles stress.
Exactly. The Yale research Riker cites indicates that children who grow up with highly involved, traditionally authoritative fathers actually develop structurally larger hippocampi.
Literally a larger piece of brain tissue.
Yes. And Riker interprets this data to mean that a strong patriarchal presence provides a specific kind of environmental stability. It isn't just about a father being nice or present. It's about an authoritative framework that reduces chronic ambient stress in the home.
Because the kid feels protected.
Right. It allows the child's brain to literally allocate more physiological resources to developing emotional control rather than staying in a constant state of fight or flight anxiety.
So he's arguing that traditional patriarchy isn't some social construct imposed on children to oppress them. He's saying it's practically a necessary nutrient for brain development.
That is his exact argument.
And he backs this up with a very specific, boots-on-the-ground example from a place called St. Cuthbert's Church. According to the book, this parish stopped doing youth therapy groups. They stopped sitting in circles talking about feelings and instead implemented mandatory father-son wilderness rites.
The total paradigm shift for a modern church.
Completely. They took these kids out into the woods, made them build campfires, navigate, and basically endure physical hardship under the strict supervision of their fathers. And the stat he drops is staggering.
The crime statistics.
Yeah. Within 3 years of implementing this, youth crime in that specific borough dropped by 61%.
And he uses that isolated success story as a stark contrast to what he sees as the macro-level failure of modern society.
Right, he zooms out.
He points to grim, large-scale statistics regarding fatherlessness. For instance, he highlights data from places like Chicago's South Side, noting that areas with 80% single-mother homes have a direct statistical correlation with a 60% high school dropout rate.
Alongside skyrocketing crime, of course.
Exactly. Riker paints a picture where the removal of the patriarchal structure doesn't just lead to, different family dynamics. He says it literally precipitates societal collapse.
Because you are raising a generation of young men who lack the neurological and behavioral regulation that an authoritative father provides.
That's his conclusion.
Yeah.
Which leads him to what he calls the woke implosion of modern institutions.
Ah, yes.
Because if biology demands strong male leadership, and the church or the university decides to actively dismantle that leadership in the name of progress, they are essentially fighting gravity.
And he brings receipts for this, right? He cites this massive, decade-long sociological study out of Oxford that tracked 500 different parishes within the Church of England.
Yes, and the data from that Oxford study is central to his critique of progressive church leadership. The study tracked church attendance, giving, and overall growth across these 500 parishes over 10 years.
And what did they find?
The findings showed that congregations led by men grew 12% faster than those led by women or egalitarian leadership teams.
12% is significant over a decade.
For Riker, this is the ultimate vindication of his biological argument. He looks at those numbers and concludes that it's not a coincidence, nor is it about sexism in the pews.
He claims it demonstrates a fundamental human reality.
Right. He says men follow strength, women follow provision and security, and children require both. He argues that progressive ideology, no matter how well-intentioned it might be, simply cannot override these deeply ingrained evolutionary directives. When institutions try to override it, they shrink.
It's a relentless critique. He's basically saying you can have your egalitarian theories, but the data shows your churches are emptying out, which actually perfectly sets up his next major point. And honestly, this was the part of the book that completely blew my mind.
The acoustic section.
Yes. We get into this idea of acoustic warfare and the power of hymns. Now, when I think of a church hymn, I think of a gentle, melodic lullaby meant to make you feel peaceful on a Sunday morning.
Most people do.
But Riker refers to hymns as bayonets for the soul. He treats music as literal psychological warfare.
It is a radical reframing of how we view liturgy. Riker argues that historical hymns, the great anthems of the Western tradition, they were never engineered for comfort or sensitivity training.
Right.
They were explicitly designed to steel the spines of men who were about to march into horrific conflict. He grounds this deeply in military history. He points to Oliver Cromwell's Ironsides.
Give us the context on the Ironsides, because this is the English Civil War, right? This isn't just a polite political disagreement.
Exactly. This is the 1640s, a brutally bloody conflict between the parliamentarians and the royalists, who were loyal to King Charles I. The Ironsides were the parliamentarian cavalry.
And they were fierce.
They were a deeply religious, highly disciplined military force. Riker points specifically to the Battle of Naseby in 1645. As these men are marching onto the battlefield facing cannon fire and enemy cavalry, they aren't just shouting chaotic battle cries.
What are they doing?
They are singing Psalm 68 in perfect unison. Let God arise, let his enemies be scattered. Riker argues that this synchronized, aggressive singing wasn't just a display of piety, it was a tactical maneuver. It bonded the men psychologically, overrode their natural fear of death, and contributed directly to their absolute decimation of the royalist forces that day.
And what's wild is that he shows how this tactic didn't just end in the 17th century. He traces this military use of hymns all the way into the modern era.
He tracks it right up to the 20th century.
Yeah, he notes that British troops sang "Onward Christian Soldiers" while literally marching into machine gun fire during the Boer War in South Africa.
A horrifying scenario.
And even as recently as 1982, during the Falklands War. He describes the Royal Marines packed into ships getting ready to retake South Georgia Island in the freezing cold, and they are chanting "Eternal Father Strong to Save."
And the result was immediate.
According to Riker, the Argentine forces surrendered within hours of the Marines making landfall. He claims the British Ministry of Defense actually still trains troops using hymn-based morale tactics because they know, on a biological level, that it works.
And that biological level is what Riker really drills down into. He doesn't just rely on these historical anecdotes to prove correlation. He brings in modern neurochemistry to explain the actual causation.
Okay, lay the neurochemistry on me.
He cites a 2017 study from the University of Frankfurt that looked at the hormonal impact of group singing.
And how does that actually work? Because if I sing in the shower, I don't feel like I'm ready to conquer a nation. What is happening in the body when a group of men sing together?
The Frankfurt research demonstrated that synchronized group singing, specifically when engaging deep diaphragmatic breathing and matching pitch with other men, it actively spikes testosterone levels in men by up to 15%.
15% just from singing?
Just from singing.
Okay.
Furthermore, it stimulates the vagus nerve, which regulates the nervous system, dropping stress and actually increasing pain tolerance.
So it's a physiological transformation.
Completely. So when you have hundreds of men bellowing a martial hymn in unison, Riker argues it ceases to be just an artistic expression. Becomes a synchronized biological event.
The vibrations, the shared breathing.
All of it. The loud volume, it all prepares the male body for aggression, for enduring hardship, and for breakthrough innovation under extreme pressure.
The physics of the acoustics get even crazier, though. He talks about this very specific phenomenon involving a 114 hertz frequency.
This is a brilliant section of the book.
He cites an acoustics lab study from MIT that analyzed the architecture in the choir stalls at St. Paul's Cathedral in London. Break this down for me, because he claims this specific frequency acts like a performance-enhancing drug.
This is where his argument bridges architectural history and cognitive science. The MIT study analyzed the resonant frequencies of the space inside St. Paul's.
And they found something unique.
They found that a specific frequency, 114 hertz, which sits right in the male resonance band, just under the natural range of a tenor, creates a unique acoustic standing wave in that specific architecture.
Okay.
When listeners are exposed to this specific frequency, the study showed it actually boosts competitive focus and cognitive sharpness by 19%.
19% sharper just by standing in the room while that frequency is playing?
Exactly. And Riker views this not as some happy accident of a Renaissance architect, but as a biological advantage that the Anglican tradition has slowly accumulated and refined over 400 years. They built spaces that physically resonate in a way that literally sharpens the male mind.
And he claims to have weaponized the science himself.
He does.
He shares this personal anecdote in the book that is just so bizarre and fascinating. He describes facing a modern Equality Commission tribunal.
Right, a legal dispute.
Yeah, he was up against a corporate diversity director for a 12-minute hearing. And instead of just reviewing his legal notes, he says he spent 30 minutes beforehand listening to Merbecca's evening service, which is a very specific, ancient choral setting of the liturgy.
And he didn't just listen to it on normal earbuds.
No, he used bone conduction headphones.
The use of bone conduction headphones is a crucial detail for him. Instead of just hearing the music through the ear canal, Bone conduction sends the acoustic vibrations directly through the skull to the inner ear, which maximizes that physical resonance he was just talking about.
Right. He claims this acoustic priming, this literal vibration of his skull with 16th century choral music, gave him such a competitive edge that he utterly dismantled his opponent's arguments.
He says his recall was flawless.
His mental sharpness was so elevated that the adjudicator actually paused the tribunal to ask if he had taken chemical stimulants.
Which is an amazing claim.
And Riker attributes his victory entirely to the strategic harmonics of the hymn. He essentially used church music to biohack his brain for a legal fight.
And he extends this concept of biohacking into the broader corporate world. He introduces what he terms the evensong advantage.
Tell us about Evensong.
Evensong is a traditional church service held New Sunset, characterized by specific choral music, liturgy, and lighting. Riker claims that top-tier modern CEOs are quietly attending these services, essentially weaponizing ancient church rituals to dominate the modern marketplace.
Yeah, he references a 2022 Oxford study finding that CEOs who attend Evensong weekly actually close 23% more deals than their peers. That sounds almost like magic until he breaks down the actual physiology behind it.
Right, and this raises an important question about how deeply our physical environments dictate our neurochemical states. Riker leans heavily into chronobiology here.
Chronobiology being the study of how our bodies react to time and light, right?
Correct. He cites Stanford engineers from 2024 who analyzed the lighting of traditional evensong services. They confirmed that the specific flickering light wavelength of beeswax candles in a darkened stone cathedral provides more natural melatonin stimulation to the human brain than wearing a $500 pair of modern blue light blocking glasses.
So they are getting better sleep and recovery simply by sitting in a candlelit church.
Precisely. And he compounds that with research from Harvard chronobiologists in 2023 who found that engaging in highly structured, repetitive sunset rituals drops cortisol, the primary stress hormone, 40% faster in men compared to simply coming home and watching television or having a drink.
40% faster recovery.
Yes. Riker's overarching point here is that the modern secular world is in a state of chronic burnout. Our nervous systems are fried by screens and unstructured stress.
We're all exhausted.
But those who plug themselves back into these ancient, rhythmic, acoustic, and visually optimized rituals are biologically recovering faster and therefore outperforming everyone else in the boardroom.
Here's where it gets really interesting because he takes this idea of ancient ritual and applies it directly to the way we use language, specifically prayer and memorization. And again, he completely flips the modern understanding on its head.
He does not view prayer as meditation.
Not at all. Most people today think of prayer as a quiet time to sit with your thoughts, process your feelings, or ask for comfort. Riker treats prayer like a special operations briefing. He introduces this concept he calls Spartan Matins. What exactly does that look like?
Well, Riker's fiercely critical of modern contemplative practices. He despises things like mindfulness meditation or what he sarcastically calls vulnerability circles.
Right.
He argues that these practices encourage passivity, lower testosterone, and ultimately rot a man's resolve. Instead, he advocates for rigid, combative, highly structured prayer. The Spartan Matins concept is illustrated by a mentee of his, a former Marine, who transitioned into a role as a Fortune 500 vice president.
Okay, so a guy who already understands intense military discipline, what is his actual daily routine?
Every single morning, before the sun rises, this executive doesn't sit cross-legged on a cushion. He stands at attention, physically locking his body into a posture of readiness.
Like a soldier.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And for 22 minutes, he recites the Te Deum completely from memory. The Te Deum is an ancient, very long Christian hymn of praise that dates back to the 4th century. It is a dense, complex piece of theological literature.
And the results Riker claims this guy achieved are staggering. He says that after 90 days of this specific routine, this VP's decision latency, which is basically the time it takes for him to analyze a problem and pull the trigger on a choice, dropped by 40%.
A massive improvement in efficiency.
And subsequently, his division's revenue spiked by 17%. Now, anyone can claim that waking up early makes you productive, but Riker uses fMRI studies from Oxford to explain the actual brain mechanics at play here.
Yes, the neurological justification is what elevates his argument from just being a self-help tip. These fMRI studies look at what happens to the brain during rote memorization and the recitation of complex creeds.
What do the scans show?
The imaging shows that this specific type of cognitive labor physically thickens the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex.
Let's break that down for the listener. What does the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex actually do for a person?
Think of it as the brain's central command center for executive function. It is responsible for complex planning, cognitive flexibility, working memory, and crucially, the suppression of impulsive, emotionally driven responses.
So it keeps you from panicking.
Exactly. By forcing the brain to perfectly recall and vocalize a 22-minute ancient text every single day, Riker argues you are essentially putting that command center through heavy resistance training.
Like lifting weights for your executive function.
Right. He compares it to how special forces operators use endless repetitive drills to build muscle memory. You drill the complex prayer into your neural pathways so deeply that when absolute chaos hits you in the boardroom or on a battlefield, your brain doesn't panic. It defaults to the structural order and resilience you've built into that prefrontal cortex.
It's treating ancient doctrine as cognitive armor, and he uses the term catechism a lot here. For listeners who might not have grown up in a traditional church, catechism is basically the rote memorization of Christian doctrine, usually structured in a strict question and answer format.
Question and answer, drilled until it's automatic.
Yeah. Riker views this as literal combat training for the mind. And he gives two incredibly intense, harrowing examples of this working in the real world when men are pushed to the absolute brink.
The first example focuses on the American penal system. He tells the story of an inmate named Mike, who was incarcerated in the Pelican Bay Supermax prison in California.
Which is notorious for its conditions.
Right. This is an environment of extreme sensory deprivation and isolation. Mike was spending 23 hours a day in solitary confinement, a situation that rapidly induces psychosis and deep despair in most human beings.
It breaks people.
It does. But according to Riker, Mike weaponized a specific passage of the Bible, Ephesians chapter 6, verses 10 through 18.
This is the famous passage about putting on the full armor of God, the belt of truth, the breastplate of righteousness, the shield of faith.
Exactly. Mike would recite this text relentlessly, using the visceral, martial imagery of the verses to construct a psychological fortress in his mind.
To keep from going insane.
Riker argues that this memorized doctrine allowed Mike to maintain his sanity against the crushing weight of solitary confinement. In fact, Mike eventually managed to communicate and catechize 40 other inmates through the plumbing pipes of the prison. The doctrine was a literal shield against psychological disintegration.
And the second example he gives is even more extreme because it deals with literal physical torture. He brings up the situation in Afghanistan after the Taliban takeover in 2021.
A truly horrifying situation.
He mentions underground Christian converts who were captured. According to Riker, during their torture sessions, these men didn't just pray for the pain to stop, they actively recited the Heidelberg Catechism. Specifically, they recited question 1.
For context, question 1 of the Heidelberg Catechism asks, "What is your only comfort in life and death?" And the memorized answer begins, "That I am not my own, but belong body and soul, in life and in death, to my faithful Savior."
It's a declaration of ultimate surrender to something higher.
Right. Riker describes the act of reciting this specific theological framework while undergoing physical torture as jujitsu against despair. It is the ultimate distillation of his argument that these old, rigid, memorized doctrines are not just Sunday school fluff.
They are survival tools.
When all your modern comforts are stripped away, when you were in a Hupermax cell or a Taliban torture chamber, that memorized doctrine functions as survival software.
And if the software is that crucial, the actual code, the specific words you use, has to be perfect. This is where Riker dives into the linguistics of Bible translation, and he has a profound, almost obsessive appreciation for the 1611 King James Version.
He reveres the King James Version.
But he doesn't love it just because it sounds poetic or Shakespearean. He argues it is a masterpiece of what he calls hierarchical engineering.
This is a fascinating linguistic analysis. Riker points out that the translators of the King James Bible in 1611 deliberately weaponized early modern English pronouns to enforce a very specific social and cosmic order.
How so?
In the text, they consistently used the pronouns thee and thou when a superior was addressing an inferior, counterintuitively to modern ears, when a human was addressing God in a posture of intimate submission.
Oh, interesting.
Conversely, they used you and ye when addressing superiors or a plural group. By embedding these subtle linguistic markers into the sacred text, Riker argues the architects of the church were structurally enforcing a psychological submission to divine authority.
They were baking hierarchy right into the grammar the population was reciting every Sunday.
Exactly.
He absolutely loves that rigid hierarchical enforcement, and because he loves the 1611 version so much, he goes absolutely scorched earth on modern Bible translations for softening it. He singles out the 2020 English Standard Version, the ESV, which is widely used today.
He has a major issue with the ESV.
He points to their translation of Ephesians 5.22. Now, in the King James Version, the text reads, "Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands." But the modern ESV Translation Committee changed it to simply read, "Wives, submit to your own husband."
They remove the word yourself.
Right. They remove the active, reflexive verb yourselves.
To a casual reader, that might seem like a minor grammatical update to make the text flow better in modern English.
Sure, just cleaning up the language.
But to Riker, this is an act of deliberate linguistic sabotage. He argues that by removing yourselves, the translators neutered the agency and the active duty of the submission.
He claims they watered it down.
He claims that modern translation committees are essentially terrified of offending modern feminists. In his view, they are actively castrating the sacred text to manufacture an egalitarianism that, according to his biological and historical framework, simply does not exist in nature.
So if the very language of the church was engineered to forge hard men and enforce hierarchy, it makes me wonder about the physical spaces they were operating in. We touched on the acoustics of St. Paul's earlier, but does he go deeper into the actual buildings and physical actions of the tradition?
He absolutely does. This brings us into the realm of physicality, architecture, and brotherhood. Riker argues that if you want to understand the true intent of historical Western institutions, you have to look at what they demanded of the male body.
The physical toll.
He starts by looking at the ancient tradition of pilgrimage. Today, people might think of a retreat as a weekend at a wellness spa with yoga and green juice. But Riker views traditional pilgrimage as intense grit training.
Right, he focuses on the Camino de Santiago, which is this ancient, grueling 500-mile pilgrimage network stretching across Europe and ending in northern Spain. You are walking for weeks, dealing with the elements, sleeping in hostels.
It is punishing.
And he brings in data to prove this isn't just a spiritual stroll. He cites a 2019 Oxford study comparing the hormonal effects of different types of exercise. What did they find?
The Oxford researchers discovered that engaging in the kind of grueling, austere, multi-day hiking required by the Camino releases 3 times more testosterone into the bloodstream than attending a modern high-intensity spin class.
3 times more.
Riker uses this to argue that the physical exertion of the pilgrimage taps into a primal evolutionary need for men to conquer distances and endure hardship. Furthermore, he brings in a 2023 Cambridge study that evaluated the psychological profiles of men who had completed these long pilgrimages.
And how did they score?
The data showed that these pilgrims exhibited a 40% higher pain tolerance and scored significantly higher on standardized leadership assessments compared to non-pilgrims.
40% higher pain tolerance is massive.
For Riker, the pilgrimage is a technology designed to force man to confront blisters, hunger, and utter exhaustion in order to permanently elevate his biological baseline for grit.
It's about breaking the body down to build the mind up. But eventually, the pilgrim reaches the destination. They arrive at the cathedral. And Riker has a whole theory on what he calls architectural testosterone.
He absolutely despises modern architecture.
He really does. He looks at those brutalist concrete buildings or the sleek modernist glass boxes we build today and calls them castrating glass shoeboxes. He believes they actively depress the human spirit. Instead, he venerates the towering, ancient stone structures of Gothic architecture.
His argument here is deeply tied to geometry and cognitive processing. He points to structures like Durham Cathedral in England. These massive buildings often utilize very specific mathematical ratios, such as the 1 to the square root of 2 proportion.
Which is famous in architecture.
Right. It is sometimes referred to in historical architecture as a defined proportion. Riker argues that this specific mathematical ratio isn't just aesthetically pleasing, it represents cosmic order embedded into stone. He believes that the human brain subconsciously recognizes this mathematics as a representation of stability and divine truth.
And he claims there is actual data showing this geometry affects performance. He cites a study involving military officers who are undergoing tactical decision-making training.
The environment changed their scores.
Yeah. When these officers were placed in Gothic revival chapels to do their training, they actually scored 19% higher on their assessments compared to when they trained in standard modernist drop-ceiling classrooms.
The mechanism he proposes for this is fascinating. Riker argues that the defining features of Gothic architecture, The soaring ribbed vaults, the pointed arches, the intricate stonework create complex fractal patterns.
What exactly does that mean for the brain?
A fractal is a complex geometric shape that looks the same at every scale of magnification, much like patterns found in nature, like the branches of a tree or a coastline. Riker hypothesizes that these specific fractal patterns perfectly synchronize with male neural pathways that have been evolutionarily optimized for spatial threat assessment.
So it's basically hitting the brain's sweet spot for scanning an environment.
Essentially, yes. He's saying that our ancestors literally encoded combat neurobiology and spatial dominance into the stone of the church. When a man stands in a Gothic cathedral, his brain registers an environment of ultimate order and vast structural power, which biologically sharpens his cognitive faculties.
So the building itself is a tool, but what about the men working inside that building? He explores the physical rites that bonded men together within those walls, and he focuses heavily on something called campanology.
Bell ringing.
For those who don't know, campanology is the art and science of bell ringing. But Riker doesn't describe it as a quaint hobby. He calls them bell-ringing brotherhoods.
Because to ring those massive multi-ton church bells in perfect mathematical sequence requires immense physical strength, precise coordination, and absolute unspoken trust among men pulling the ropes.
It's incredibly dangerous if you mess it up.
It is. Riker views these traditional bell-ringing groups as the ultimate merit-based brotherhoods. To illustrate what happens when these brotherhoods are compromised by modern ideology, he shares a highly publicized story from Canterbury Cathedral.
Oh, this story is wild. Walk us through what happened at Canterbury.
According to Riker's account, in 2021, the leadership at Canterbury Cathedral caved to internal pressure regarding diversity quotas. In an effort to make the bell-ringing team more inclusive and less of a boys' club, they brought in ringers who did not have the traditional, rigorous apprenticeship background.
They bypassed the merit system.
Exactly. And the result was a catastrophic failure in competence. One of the newly integrated ringers lost control of the rope, and a massive 14th century tenor bell was dropped, causing 120,000 pounds in structural damage to the ancient tower.
Unbelievable.
Riker uses this incredibly expensive accident as a metaphor. He contrasts it with traditional brotherhoods that have maintained perfect safety records for over 2 centuries, arguing that the moment you allow diversity ideology and progressive quotas to override strict, merit-based hierarchy, the literal foundations of the institution begin to crumble.
He's basically saying that gravity and momentum don't care about your inclusion policies. If you don't have the strength and the training, the bell falls.
That's the physics of it.
And he carries this theme of visceral, unapologetic masculinity into how these brotherhoods celebrated. This brings us to a section he titles Feasting as Frontal Assault, which is just an incredible phrase.
He has a way with words.
He does. Riker has zero interest in polite parish potlucks with cucumber sandwiches. He talks about feasting as a historical weapon. He brings up Wat Tyler's rebellion. What is the historical context there?
Wat Tyler was the leader of the Peasants' Revolt in 1381, a massive uprising against extreme taxation and the rigid class structure of medieval England.
A huge, violent, populist movement.
Yes. And Riker points out a specific logistical detail of this rebellion. As the peasant army marched on London, they were fueled by the consumption of 60,000 gallons of ale that had been brewed and stockpiled by Westminster Abbey.
60,000 gallons.
For Riker, this isn't just a historical footnote about alcohol. He views fermented grain, meat, and massive caloric feasts as the essential fuel that builds empires and terrifies tyrants. The feast is a biological bonding agent that creates a fearless collective.
And he brings that concept right into the modern day to show how traditional men are using it to push back against progressive church policies. He recounts a story about a recent St. Cuthbert's Day feast held at Durham Cathedral.
This is a perfect modern example for his thesis.
The local progressive diocese have been pushing heavily for a carbon-neutral agenda, trying to get parishes to reduce their carbon footprints, eat less meat, focus on climate change, that sort of thing.
And the response from this specific group of men was an act of calculated defiance. 300 men gathered for this feast and consumed 2 entirely whole roasted oxen.
2 whole oxen.
Riker describes this not merely as a meal, but as a deliberate theatrical provocation. While the progressive clergy run their hands over methane emissions and dietary optics, these men were actively honoring the visceral, patriarchal, and highly caloric roots of their faith.
Just a massive display of traditionalism.
Riker views this extreme feast as a counter-revolutionary act, a way to forge unbreakable loyalty among traditionalists by engaging in a shared unapologetically masculine ritual that completely flouts modern progressive sensibilities.
It's all about drawing a line in the sand and pushing back against the modern institutional structure. And that leads us to the final major theme of the book, which focuses heavily on cancel culture, parish politics, and financial warfare.
This is where he gets into the modern mechanics of power.
Riker goes on the absolute offensive here against what he calls the woke inquisition. We've all seen how modern cancel culture works on social media, but Riker compares it to a very specific, bloody event in English history, the murder of Thomas Becket. Who was Becket, and why is this the analogy he uses?
Thomas Becket was the Archbishop of Canterbury in the 12th century. He was originally a close friend of King Henry II, but once Becket became Archbishop, he fiercely defended the independence of the church against the king's authority.
And it ended badly.
The tension boiled over in 1170. The king, in a moment of extreme frustration, supposedly uttered an offhand remark, something along the lines of, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?"
He didn't issue an order, just complained out loud.
Right. But four of the king's knights heard this, interpreted it as a royal command, rode to Canterbury Cathedral, and brutally hacked Becket to death right in front of the altar.
And Riker says today's progressive mobs operate the exact same way, right?
Yes, his comparison is very direct. Riker argues that in modern cancel culture, the progressive elite, whether in media, academia, or church leadership function like King Henry, they casually establish the new orthodoxies of gender, race, or theology.
And then they just point the finger.
And when a traditionalist challenges those orthodoxies, the elite don't even have to issue a formal decree. They make an offhand remark or a subtle condemnation. And the social media mobs, acting as the modern knights, ride out to financially and socially execute the dissenter. It's a decentralized system of destruction aimed at anyone who challenges the new progressive state religion.
And this raises an important question in Riker's view about a fundamental double standard in how society treats different groups. He believes there is a two-tiered justice system specifically designed to target and suppress traditional Christian men.
This raises an important question about the legal system itself.
Right, and he points to a glaring disparity in municipal funding to prove his point.
This is a cornerstone of his political argument. Riker highlights a situation in the UK where the Brighton Mosque received £100,000 in public funding from the local council to help facilitate their programs.
And what did those programs include?
They explicitly included teaching and practicing traditional Islamic gender segregation.
Okay.
However, around the exact same time, a local Baptist men's group was fined £20,000 by authorities simply for holding a private meeting where women were not present, citing anti-discrimination laws.
The double standard is wild.
Riker uses this stark contrast to argue that progressive politicians and prosecutors use the concept of religious freedom highly selectively. He claims they will accommodate the traditionalism of minority groups, but will use the legal system to financially crucify white, working class, or traditional Christian men who attempt to maintain their own sex-segregated spaces.
So if the legal system and the social media mobs are stacked against them, how does Riker say these traditional men should fight back? He says they need to fight with their wallets.
Financial judo.
Yes, he introduces this concept he calls tactical tithing, or financial judo. He points back to the biblical principle found in Malachi 3.0, which talks about bringing the tithes into the storehouse. But he combines that ancient theology with modern financial data.
He notes that 78% of all charitable giving in these institutions still comes from men.
And his directive here is ruthlessly pragmatic. He advocates for the absolute coordinated defunding of any progressive church movement.
Starve the beast, essentially.
If the institution relies on the capital generated by traditional men, Riker argues those men must weaponize that capital to force the institution into submission.
And he gives some incredible specific examples of this strategy working in real time. He talks about a group of wealthy businessmen in Surrey.
Walk us through that one.
The progressive female church wardens at their local parish had initiated a project to tear out traditional facilities and build a massive, expensive, gender-neutral bathroom complex.
And how did the businessmen respond?
In response, this coalition of businessmen simply turned off the tap. They collectively withheld £250,000 in scheduled tithes and donations.
Wow, just held it back.
They explicitly stated that the funds would remain in escrow until the bathroom project was permanently canceled and the money was redirected to essential roof repairs.
And it worked.
The financial leverage worked exactly as Riker suggests it should. The parish could not survive the cash flow crisis. The bathroom project was scrapped, The female church wardens resigned, and traditional male leadership was restored to the parish council within 3 months.
He gives another example of a parish where a traditional group demanded an audit of the church budget. They found that $200,000 had been quietly earmarked by the leadership to purchase a completely new set of inclusive, gender-neutral hymn books.
And they shut it down.
By threatening to pull their funding, the men successfully orchestrated a boardroom coup, scrapped the hymn books entirely, and redirected the entire $200,000 to physically rebuild and restore the massive traditional church organ.
It's literal financial warfare to preserve the acoustic warfare we talked about earlier.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And speaking of capital, this leads Riker to the most explosive revelation in his financial critique. He pulls back the curtain on the overarching wealth of the Church of England itself. He titles this section, The £8.7 billion Secret.
It's an incredible amount of money.
To understand how a religious institution amassed this level of wealth, Riker takes the reader back to 1539 and the actions of King Henry VIII.
Right, the dissolution of the monasteries.
Give us the deep dive on how this accidentally made the modern church so insanely rich.
When Henry VIII broke away from the Catholic Church in Rome, he ordered the dissolution or the disbanding of all the Catholic monasteries, priories, and convents across England, Wales, and Ireland.
He just took it all.
The crown confiscated all their massive land holdings and vast wealth. However, over the subsequent centuries, the newly established Church of England was granted massive tracts of this land, and they began leasing these properties, investing the rents, and accumulating capital.
Generational wealth building.
Fast forward to today, and that historical land grab has evolved into a staggeringly sophisticated real estate portfolio and private equity empire.
And who manages all this money today?
It is managed by a body known as the Church Commissioners. Riker reveals that this group manages an endowment of approximately £8.7 billion.
That is a staggering figure.
And they aren't just letting it sit in low-yield savings accounts. Riker points out that the Church Commissioners consistently generate a 10.1% return on investment.
Wait, 10.1%?
Yes. To put that in perspective, that rate of return actively outperforms 92% of all professional pension funds in the United Kingdom.
So how is a church generating better returns than Wall Street bankers?
That is exactly the hypocrisy Riker seeks to expose. He dives into their investment portfolio and reveals that to achieve those massive returns, the Church Commissioners invest heavily in aggressive private equity firms.
What are those firms buying?
These firms often own massive stakes in everything from global weapons manufacturers to predatory online gambling applications.
You're kidding. Weapons and gambling.
Riker highlights the absolute cognitive dissonance here. You have progressive archbishops delivering sermons condemning the military-industrial complex, condemning capitalism and systemic inequality, while the institution itself is quietly making billions of pounds off the back of defense contractors and casino apps.
The hypocrisy is just blatant to him. He even includes this amazing hot mic moment from the current Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby.
I remember reading that quote.
According to the book, during a particularly heated internal debate about the ethics of their financial investments, Welby was supposedly heard muttering under his breath, "Sheep don't audit shepherds."
Sheep don't audit shepherds.
So Riker uses that quote as the ultimate proof of his thesis. He argues that despite all the progressive, egalitarian posturing, the core of the institution still fundamentally operates on raw power, hierarchy, and massive capital.
And so his conclusion is a call to action.
Therefore, if traditional men want to reclaim their culture, they cannot do it by politely asking for inclusion. They must ruthlessly weaponize their own capital and biology to take the institution back by force.
It is a bracing conclusion.
So, what does this all mean? We've covered a massive amount of ground today, and I am speaking directly to you, the listener, right now. Look, whether you find Conrad Riker's fiercely traditional red-pilled politics to be a breath of fresh air, or whether you find his worldview completely abhorrent and dangerous, his book forces you to confront a deeply unsettling and fascinating idea.
It absolutely does.
He has presented a meticulously researched argument suggesting that the things we take for granted, the ancient rites, the towering Gothic architectures, the resonant frequencies of choral music, the rote memorization of ancient text, none of these were random accidents of history or mere aesthetic choices.
They were technologies.
According to Riker, they were deeply calculated, highly evolved technologies designed specifically to optimize human biology, spike testosterone, and build the psychological resilience required for a civilization to survive a brutal world.
It forces us to reconsider the entire narrative of human progress. We like to think we have evolved past the need for rigid hierarchies and harsh physical rights. But Riker's data asks us to look at history strictly through the lens of evolutionary utility,
Which is a whole different perspective.
and it leaves us with a deeply provocative thought for you to ponder on your own. If acoustic frequencies like 114 hertz, specific architectural ratios in cathedrals, and the grueling rote memorization of doctrine objectively alter human neurochemistry to build group cohesion and fortitude, what's that mean for today?
Right.
Are modern secular attempts to build community inherently doomed to fail? If we constantly try to create inclusive, soft, and comfortable spaces while completely ignoring the biological hardware of the human animal, the hardware that evolved to respond to hierarchy, struggle, and resonance, can those modern communities ever achieve the lasting power, the resilience, and the historical impact of the institutions that built the modern world?
It is a massive, heavy question. And to truly grasp the depth of the arguments, to analyze the biological data, and to read the historical anecdotes we've discussed today in their full context, you absolutely need to read the source material for yourself.
Do not just take our word for it.
Exactly.
Okay.
Go check Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks right now to buy Conrad Riker's ebook, Church of England Great Hymns, Traditions, Prayer, Pilgrimage, and Rites. And if you want to see how he applies these theories to current events in real time, be sure to follow him at Conrad M. Riker on Substack for more of his writings.
It's a debate that isn't going away anytime soon.
Finally, we want to ask you one last time to please like and subscribe to the podcast. Your support is what allows us to keep digging into these intense, complex topics. Thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us today. We'll see you on the next one.